Okay, let's see what happens.
You didn't prepare today or something?
Oh, I don't know. Just watch the YouTube, see what happens. So that will be streamed live on our, right? Yeah. Oh, shoot. I just want the screen. So I need to make this. Wait, how do I make this bigger? Can't I make this bigger? Let me click it. I got 9 people. Cool, so I'm just gonna let it run, see what happens.
It's all right. Yeah, you better do it double. You guys don't work out with me.
There's more than 800 of them, actually. In case you missed anything, you can access all the session recordings. We've organised them nicely into 14 themes. Get them anytime on YouTube from the 12th of December, no login required. And for all our paying delegates, we have something special for you. You will get a specially curated 4-part SFF 2020 Insights report, and it covers all sessions featuring 800 plus speakers and our partner content as well. Do also look out for your SFF 2021 discount. That voucher will be exclusively for you. Now, in this next session, Kristalina Georgieva, who is the Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund, will give us a global perspective on how payments will look and continue to evolve in the digital age. So let's go to Kristalina to hear opinions on how payments are to evolve.
Thank you very much, Marisha. Never too late to join the International Monetary Fund. I just did it last year. I want to thank also the Monetary Authority of Singapore for the invitation. It is a great honor to join policymakers and entrepreneurs from around the world. 2020 has been an extremely difficult year. The pandemic has caused immense suffering. Too much of the economic toll has been borne by the most vulnerable people in wealthier and in poorer countries alike. But there are some bright spots: heroic nurses and doctors saving lives, essential workers keeping the lights on, water running, stores shelved full. And there are many others who kept businesses going, like the people of the technology industry. You have profoundly changed our way of working, interacting, and living our daily lives. You have brought the digital future to our fingertips and to our doorsteps. So let me capture a vision of that future and the 4 cornerstones needed to build it. Now, picture a furniture maker, a skilled artisan working in a factory in Thailand. Recession hits, she loses her job, then with unemployment benefits sent to her phone, she starts her own workshop and sells locally. The artisan makes and receives mobile payments. She chooses to share her payment data, allowing her to get an online loan to hire people and to grow her business. One day, she gets a message asking if she ships abroad. You no longer have to be big to be global. A digital platform processes her payments from abroad at a low cost, and it provides insurance, savings, and investment options for her deposits, making her livelihood more resilient. None of this would have been possible even 10 years ago. This is a story about human drive and ingenuity, a story about the revolution in payments that erases physical distance, that generates data, which is the new gold, and hence often the new collateral. It is about payments that are cheap and widely accessible, that are seamlessly integrated in our digital lives. And as the way we make payments changes, our world changes. We can provide access to financial services for 1.7 billion adults who are still unbanked, and help many more vulnerable people who are currently paying high fees. Also, the banking and financial industry is being reshaped by data, automation, and real-time analytics. And finally, payment innovations can change the international monetary system, the ways in which we transact across borders, access foreign assets, exchange currencies, and price goods. And digital payments are not just for the tech savvy, they have huge implications for the whole world. So we must tread courageously and carefully. We must ensure that payments evolve to meet user needs while remaining safe and resilient. And that's at the micro level. At the macro level, we need to foster a financial sector and international monetary system that are efficient and trusted, equitable and inclusive, and still dynamic. The artisan's digital future will rest on 4 cornerstones: private sector innovation, public sector involvement, regulatory and legal frameworks, and international cooperation. So let's look at each of these 4 pillars. Private sector innovation has served many people well. Think of the bank accounts in which we save, the cards we use to pay, or the mobile money of our artisan. Many people still use cash, but the numbers can decrease rapidly. Take Sweden, where only 10% of the adult population still uses cash, down from 40% a decade ago. In the same period, mobile money accounts in Kenya increased exponentially from 12 million to 61 million, more than the country's population. The private sector is best able to gauge the needs of people and businesses, provide the diversity of products and services they want, and take the risks necessary for innovation. But we must ensure these risks do not translate into risks to end users of the financial system. And we must avoid other pitfalls, such as monopoly power or underserving vulnerable people. And for that, to avoid these risks, we need the other 3 cornerstones. Next one, public sector involvement to provide verifiable digital ID, communications infrastructure, central bank money, and other necessities. It is digital ID that allows our artisan to enroll in new financial services. It is one precondition to financial inclusion. The other, internet access. Our story only works if the artisan is online. And nearly half of the world's people are not, including 75% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa. The picture is reversed in North America, where around 75% are connected. The IMF strongly encourages investment in infrastructure now as part of the post-COVID recovery effort. A synchronized public investment push is best. If countries act together, they can achieve 2/3 more at the same cost than if each country acts alone. And they can draw in critical private investment as well. And of course, central bank money. Traditionally, notes, coins, reserves remains essential. The ability of our Thai artisan to convert the digital money she receives into local currency on demand is a key metric of stability. Central currency also helps her accept payments in mobile money issued by different providers. Just like a common language, central bank money allows one provider to pay another. With this foundation, each fintech company can offer and evolve its own services. Interoperability gives wings to innovation and diversity in payments. How could central bank money evolve in the digital age? As new payment providers emerge, will they too have access to central bank money? Will a digital version of notes and coins be introduced? Many countries are considering just that possibility. While the form of central bank money may change, its function should not. It should still anchor the stability of other forms of money while enabling their evolution and diversity. Let me go to the third cornerstone. It is equally important. Robust regulatory and legal frameworks should allow innovation and startups to flourish while achieving essential goals, protection and privacy for consumers, countering money laundering and other crimes, and providing stability and resilience for all. Regulatory clarity is essential and particularly challenging as technology and products evolve rapidly. Starting a business is not difficult because there are multiple forms to fill out. It is difficult if we don't know how many more there will be to fill next. New entrants will ask, what rules am I subject to? Will my product be considered a deposit, a security, a payment system, or something else? In the tradition of Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's government continues to innovate. Its new payments law is promising. It seeks to define digital payment instruments and to adopt an activity and risk-based approach to regulating payments. Done right, that levels the playing field for new entrants. Same activity, same risks, same rules. But evaluating these risks raises new questions. For instance, our artisan offered payments data in place of collateral. But are loans based on more accurate data and analytics less risky? Should she pay less? Lawmakers and regulators should be given the resources to succeed and stay ahead of the curve. Answer these questions. They will need to be far-sighted and collaborative given the wide ramifications of new payments. Central banks and finance ministries working with antitrust agencies, privacy groups, data protection agencies, law enforcement, civil society, and consumer advocates, just to name a few. And just as money crosses borders, so too must our regulatory efforts. This brings me to the final cornerstone, international cooperation, including to facilitate international payments and manage spillover effects. Will our artisan be able to send money across borders as easily as we send text messages? Or will she have to pay 7% average fees as do today's 800 million people who depend on remittances. But sending money is more involved than sending texts. It will require technology standards between digital monies, mutual regulatory and legal treatments, and ID systems that are trusted across borders. The Financial Stability Board, with our support, recently offered a roadmap to enhance cross-border payments. But much work lies ahead to implement it. Cooperation is also key to address spillovers. As digital money becomes more widespread, effects will ripple around the world. These include domestic currencies being swapped for more enticing foreign currencies, reduced monetary policy effectiveness, and circumvention of capital account restrictions. Spillovers can be even more far-reaching. Under some conditions, new digital money can affect the international monetary system. The nations of the world created the IMF to help them guide the international monetary system and make it an engine of growth for everyone. At a time when the risks of further divergence between rich and poor has increased, we recognize that responsibility has never been greater. Today, we stand ready to help foster a more resilient monetary system, one that is more inclusive, smarter, and greener. Nobel Peace Laureate and former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf once said, "If your dreams do not scare you, they're not big enough." Global companies, startup entrepreneurs, and our artisans are dreaming big. We need to make the payments revolution work for all. Thank you.
Kristalina Georgieva, I cannot thank you enough on behalf of the whole team here at the Singapore FinTech Festival for that wonderful address and for such clarity on how we've all benefited, but in particular, those whom the IMF helps so much from these digital and efficient payment systems. Thank you so much. And for all of our audience, we hope that you now have a clearer idea of how far payments have progressed and how they'll continue to change and improve in the digital age.
Well, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome on behalf of the IMF to everyone who's able to participate today. This is the closing session of the IMF's 8th Statistical Forum, and it's on the theme of measuring the economics of the pandemic. It's a special pleasure for me to introduce this closing session today and our two very special guests. One of those guests, Ian Golden, our keynote speaker, happens to be my former boss. And our other speaker, our discussant today, Kristalina Georgieva, is my current boss. And so this is a really special opportunity for me, which I appreciate having been given by my good friend and colleague, Louis-Marc Ducharme, who, as the Director of Statistics at the IMF, has organized this entire conference so well. So hats off to Louis-Marc and everyone who pulled this off. Let me turn to our keynote speaker. Ian Golden is very well known on the international scene. Ian is the Oxford University Professor of Globalization and Development. He's the director of the Oxford Martin Programme on Technological and Economic Change. And he's also the founding director of the Oxford Martin School. Ian has had an illustrious career prior to his time at Oxford, including his work in very senior positions at the World Bank, at the EBRD, at the OECD, and numerous other positions. Ian is also an illustrious author. Far too many books and publications to mention, but perhaps most notably, and we'll hear a bit more about this today, a book called The Butterfly Effect: How Globalization Creates Systemic Risks. So look forward to hearing from Ian just in a second. As I mentioned, our second speaker today, and it will actually be, I think, a very interesting conversation between Ian and Kristalina Georgieva. Kristalina, of course, is the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. A number of firsts in Kristalina's eminent career, including being the first managing director of the IMF to come from an emerging market country. But Kristalina is also the first managing director of the IMF, who's also been acting president of the World Bank, as well as CEO of the World Bank, and various senior leadership positions at the European Commission, including European Commissioner for Crisis. And, what could be more fitting that we have someone experienced in crisis to be leading the IMF at this time of unprecedented crisis. So, with that, I think this is going to be something we can really look forward to. And I want to turn it over to Ian for his keynote speech, after which we will have the discussion. And Ian is going to speak to us about economics, institutions, multilateralism, lessons from the crisis. Ian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. It's a huge honor for me to be invited to do this keynote and to do it together with the managing director in a conversation with mutual fund. I have nothing but the highest regard for what both Jerry and the managing director have done. Jerry was indeed someone I worked very closely with, and I've been delighted to see how he's been even more effective in his time at the fund, at a time when it has got so much better at communicating what it does, and indeed in what it does. And that has been particularly true during the COVID crisis. And I want to commend the managing director, who arrived very shortly before it, was thrown into the very deep end of a very dark pool, and has managed to absolutely excel with flying colors in this, not only achieving things which the IMF has never done in its history in record time, but doing so remotely, with staff dispersed, with the board dispersed, and of course with a global emergency which is unprecedented in the history of the IMF. So it's a huge honor to be able to share a conversation with her. What I'd like to reflect on is how the pandemic has changed our understanding of economics, of institutions, and in the context of this forum, data and our data needs. What the pandemic is doing is accelerating, compressing into the space of this year and the year that will follow, processes, changes in the world over many decades. Not so many things are fundamentally different to what would have happened, but what is different is this urgency, this compression, and with it, a need to think more rapidly, to accelerate our thinking and, of course, our actions. And it's that challenge which we all face in whatever part of whatever organization we're in, around the world, and in our daily lives, as we're having to adjust to this new reality with the immense stresses it brings. It will not last, but the question is, what are the lasting changes? What is the long economic equivalent of long COVID? How will this scar the world economy? And how will the changes that we're thinking about data and economics institutions have a permanence? I worry about the expression bouncing back or reset, because bouncing back implies that we go back onto the same tracks we were before, and reset similarly could imply that we restart the operating system that we had before, when what we need is something different. It's that business as usual. It's that way of approaching our national economies, our societies, and the global community that has got us into the crisis that we're in. And if we don't set ourselves on a different path, nationally, globally, we inevitably are heading towards future disasters, which could be even worse than this, a pandemic which is worse, but catastrophic climate change and the intersection of forces which one can only describe as leading to a dystopian world. And so this inflection point, this moment in history, creates an opportunity. It creates an opportunity to start afresh and to reconsider things in a rather fundamental way. And already taboos that would have been regarded as impossible in January of this year have become the orthodoxy. And we see that so clearly, not least in the policies and the practices of the IMF, which has so admirably been able to say, we will do things differently because the circumstances are different. The time demands this of us, and we will rise to this occasion. COVID-19 has accelerated a shift in economics that was underway, a shift to a realization that we need to be much more sensitive to the multiple factors that influence human behavior. The models that Milton Friedman and others developed about rational economic individuals driving history. The idea that there's no such thing as society, only individuals, which of course both Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan championed, have been shown to not be fit for purpose. Individuals have shown remarkable solidarity, sacrificing their own lives for others, literally in the case of doctors and care home workers, but also young people who are staying at home, who are sacrificing their social life, who are sacrificing their studies and schooling often, who are sacrificing their job prospects and are inheriting a massive debt. In all, the elderly, the average mortality age is 82. There's less chance for a young person of being struck by lightning than of being killed by COVID-19, and lightning does not happen very frequently in the UK. We are being shown to be not simply rational individuals, and this, I believe, needs to be embedded in the new economics. Already it was happening with a lot of awareness, growing awareness of behavioral economics and other economics processes of externality, the side spillovers of our actions, not least the work being done by those on climate change and environmental spillovers, social capital, natural capital. And of course, the non-rational behavior of individuals, that we don't simply act in our own self-interest or rationally, we act in the interests of others. And that is a fundamental change which now needs to be embedded in more thinking. We're also going to have to develop a more interdisciplinary toolbox, as we recognize that it's not simply economic decisions that we need to consider, but also non-economic, the broader impact on the economy, this terrible trade-off between life and life abilities, livelihoods, the terrible trade-offs between generations, and the highly differentiated impact on different, some doing fabulously in the pandemic, not least the wealthy, who have seen their assets on the stock market soar, particularly in technology, but more broadly, and those who have suffered dreadfully within our countries and between our countries. A number of the initiatives, including those I've been involved with, like coreecon.org and INET, are grappling with some of these issues. When it comes to economic statistics, we have been found to often be in the dark. And of course, what policymakers need more urgently than ever is the signposts that they can navigate. But this has been a fog. And the ability to do things in the old way has proved to be deeply problematic. People are no longer at the office to pick up phone calls. We can't do the data analysis on inflation or other that we used to be done by walking around retail stores from the central banks, by doing surveys of their activities, their prices. That sort of thing and survey work has become something of the past. And so we need to think, and it is happening, and the IMF has been at the forefront of this, into how one thinks about real-time data flows, how one harvests the massive potential of the technology firms, and perhaps one aspect of the regulators should indeed be that we get their data in a timely manner. The extraordinary crunching capacity of new computing, AI and other, gives us opportunities to have real-time. But for that real-time economic analysis, we need real-time data flow, anonymized, of course, where necessary. Machine learning allows these possibilities. But there are many new challenges as well which have been thrown up between these new mismatches. And we need to think more carefully about the digital economy. As intangibles become a bigger and bigger share of our GDP and economic activity, how do we measure intangibles, which has been an immensely complex area of economics and finance and measurement for a while. But now we have to get to grips with it in a way that has not happened before, because it is such a big share of our economy. And what do hours of work mean when people no longer work in offices or 9 to 5, when they work flexi time at home? How do we think about this in terms of presence at work? And how do we think about production by national activity or locality when people are remote, and indeed country to where the firm is producing the digital flows? And so borders become much more problematic in a digital world and an intangible world in all respects. And of course, this can be used by firms as it is to race to the bottom, arbitrage on taxes and on others, locating themselves in notional production factories of tax havens. And as the IMF and OECD and others have been so engaged, this needs to be resolved urgently as a bigger share of the economy becomes digital. In this challenge, the importance of being able to get a handle on some of the very massive new developments, like negative interest rates, which are increasingly accounting with levels of debt which are unprecedented in peacetime for a bigger share of the overhanging economies. Huge intellectual challenges, huge data challenges, which require an urgency of resolution because they are so central to our economic activities. And just like we're finding in health, where the absence of test and trace or real-time data is leading to health officials and policymakers to be stabbing in the dark, the danger in some areas of economic policy is. And when we think of the challenges we want to overcome, like growing inequality, like climate change, this becomes even more acute. Increasing the granularity matters of the data. Who is it that is losing their job? Who is it whose incomes have been enhanced? And when we see the very adverse effects of the crisis on income inequality, that it's the essential workers, and particularly Black, Asian, and ethnic minority groups who are particularly vulnerable to the health emergency, and then to the economic emergency. We find that neighborhoods with high incidence of minority groups have much higher mortality rates, therefore they lock down more, therefore they're more economically vulnerable, and they're essential workers that have to go to work. They do not have the luxury of working from home, and therefore they are in double jeopardy from their neighborhood and from their workplace being moved. We see too that the informal sector becomes an increasingly significant part of the story of vulnerability. In Africa, perhaps half of people are in the informal sector in many economies. In India, 30-40% in the informal sector, and yet not captured adequately in the data. We don't know who the people are. They are not receiving the transfers that they require. And as we think through the implications of this, the need for supplementary data, for a dashboard approach rather than single measurement becomes more important. There's long been a discussion on the reliance and over-reliance in GDP and other statistics, but we've been slow to create dashboards. And it's that which now needs to be provided much more effectively. The crisis has been a wake-up call to people involved in data, on economics, as it has been in health, on the need to be able to provide this information. And as in health, there's been this scientific leapfrogging with a global collaboration, so too does there need to. What we haven't seen at the level that we've seen in health is this level of collaboration amongst central banks, amongst statistical groups and data groups around the world to resolve these shared problems which everyone is facing simultaneously. When I speak to my colleagues working on the vaccine in Oxford, they tell me about this unprecedented sharing and the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to help them do the genome sequencing and to understand the potency. And that is the aspiration, I believe, that we need to accelerate data collaboration. There are so many different dimensions of this. There are so many new measures and frameworks that need to be done. There's so much deeper understanding we need of the social and ecological impact of economic activities, and of course, of the jobs. This is all work in progress. Nothing can be made perfect immediately. But it's that work in progress and the learning from it through randomized experimentation, but also from simple exchanges, that is so urgent. And to the extent that it can be done remotely, it needs to be. There are many puzzles which still go to the heart of these questions. The one I'm most deeply involved in personally is the productivity paradox. Where has productivity gone? Why is it that we have an absolute stagnation of productivity across the OECD countries? And yet, we have this technological accelerating advance. Now, there are 22 different explanations from this, ranging from those which are to do with mismeasurement, to institutional explanations, to explanations about the aging and demographic transformation of societies, to explanations about the ideas factory that the knowledge tree is not bearing fruit anymore. None of these explanations, and not least the mismeasurement explanations, provide sufficient answers to the puzzle. Because even if there was 100% mismeasurement, even if we did not measure adequately some of these free digital goods, we still would not account, given their contribution to the economy, for the halving of productivity growth in this millennium. Now, getting to grips with this is essentially for me to get to grips with the response. What is it that governments can do in order to enhance productivity? And that enhancement of productivity is, of course, essential if we are to have sustainable and inclusive growth. Without it, we cannot improve the overall level of well-being of societies. Turning to the institutional responses to the COVID-19 crisis, my view is that this has been extremely uneven. Again, I want to commend the IMF for exemplary responses. I could not wish for more from an institution, particularly an institution which is under such transformational stress in terms of working remotely, having a remote board, not being able to visit the countries of operations, and the many other challenges, not to mention the newness of the managing director who's done so well. But the IMF stands out as an exception, not as the rule, in its ability to do this. And what we've seen is a very tepid response from many institutions. Now, I used to beat up on institutions because I felt it was somehow their fault, but increasingly I recognize it's the shareholders that need to be held to account, like it is of a company that is not operating effectively. And it's their shareholders who've been so unable to meet the challenge collectively of COVID-19. This stands in remarkable contrast to the 2008 crisis, when another Republican in the White House, George W. Bush, convened a G8 summit, and there was this global response with China, as you'll recall, throwing more resource at this than the rest of the world put together to drag the world economy. The fiscal stimulus and the monetary stimulus this time has been remarkable in the context of the rich countries themselves, over $12 trillion, and supported by the IMF, rightly so, but remarkably so given its history, to increase debt beyond the thresholds that were taboo of 100% before. This has been the right response, and it's helped countries that are rich enough to weather this crisis, both the companies who've been frozen and, of course, employers, workers, and those depending on the state. This has been the right response, but it's been a response which has been limited to the countries that can afford to do it for themselves. And it's the failure of this response with respect to developing countries which is the most disturbing aspect of this crisis. The lack of solidarity globally, which has been shown. Too little, too late. What we've seen in sharp contrast to the 2008 crisis and to previous crises is a real failure of global leadership. The IMF has done what it can in a very constrained world, and its commitment of $100 billion is remarkable in the speed of time it has been achieved. But there's many institutions which should be doing much more. And much more than that, there should be a global agreement to ensure much more funding. I'm very much in favor of the SDR proposal, and I hope that that's advanced. The G20 meeting this coming weekend. The credit rating agencies, in my view, have acted perversely by downgrading countries that should be shown to be in trying to improve their fiscal position through accepting debt moratorium, but there needs to be debt write-off as well at the scale that was at IPIC. And of course, there needs to be much more coordination with private lenders and with non-DAC actors, not least China. But this is the greatest development disaster of our lifetime, and it's one that requires a much greater response. The key question as well, of course, is the extent to which the stimulus packages will reinforce or undermine the other emergency we are dealing with, which is the climate emergency. And it's that which requires much greater attention, because there's a danger, as happened after the 2008 crisis response, that the money goes into steel and cement, and that carbon emissions shoot up rather than creating a Green New Deal. That would be a tragic opportunity wasted. And as the IMF has shown so effectively in its work, in the Fiscal Monitor and elsewhere, this can be the source of shovel-ready job creation with multiplier effects. And if this is done synchronously between countries, that will be even more effective. But that requires the stepping up. It's no accident that the countries that have done best and the institutions that have done best, the IMF, ECB, and countries are female-led. And it raises a very interesting question. I do not believe that we're seeing a difference between democracies and autocracies in institutions, but rather between capable and effective leadership, and that which is driven by populist concerns and ego. Not able to listen to the experts, those that have followed the WHO assiduously, like those that have followed the IMF assiduously, have done well. And this teaches us a lesson that having experts at home is important. And certainly the UK and US have plenty of experts at home on health and economics, but it has not helped them when it comes to this crisis in the absence of leadership. In terms of interventions that now go forward, my view is that we are in a state of huge opportunity. This pandemic creates the framework for the establishment of a more inclusive and sustainable globalization. Many have talked about how it's undermining globalization. It's not reflected in statistics. It's not reflected in the statistics. Certain additional flows on scientific and idea flows, the spread of Black Lives Matter around the world, or indeed the news around the world and anti-vaccination movements. It's not reflected either in investment flows, not least to China, which are at record levels thanks to its opening up, or container traffic across the Pacific, where container rates are higher than ever. The supply chain transformation was happening anyway because of automation and other forces, and that has been accelerated. The key question now is, how do we unwind from this fiscal stimulus to create a more inclusive, sustainable globalization? And that requires actions at home as well as internationally and regionally. As I argued in The Butterfly Defect, connectivity inevitably leads to systemic risk. And therefore, we have to be more effective at managing it and stopping the risks while harvesting the opportunities. It would be a disaster, not least for poor people who are yet to climb the income, energy, and other curves which they so desperately need, if we say, let's revert to protectionism and nationalism. There's no wall high enough that will keep out the threats that countries face, even the richest countries, like the US or others. No wall high enough that will keep out climate change or pandemics or other threats. But what the high walls do keep out is the opportunities to learn, the technologies, the investments, the jobs, the export opportunities, and of course, what we need, like technologies in vaccines and others. And most of all, what those high walls keep out is the ability to cooperate. And it's that renewal of multilateralism, it's that renewal of a commitment to work together to defeat our common problems that needs to be reinvigorated by this pandemic. The pandemic has proved the value of international institutions. The IMF has been there. It's the only institution for many that is able to overcome the short-term crises that they face. The WHO has proved itself absolutely remarkable. Those that have followed it have done best, despite very difficult circumstances. All institutions need reform and more resources. They need the willingness of their shareholders to make them fit for 21st century purpose, and that requires a renewed commitment to make them effective, not to undermine them. And it's that effectiveness which will be the test of whether this pandemic leads to institutional reinforcement, whether we can get back on track as we desperately need to do to achieve the SDGs, or whether it will go down in history as the beginning of a more fragmented, the world unable to manage these threats. Managing these threats is not rocket science. Even pandemics could be stopped, and certainly we know how to stop accelerating climate change, antimicrobial resistance, financial crises, cyber attacks, and all the other great threats we face. It's a question not so much of technical expertise, in the same way as overcoming poverty and inequality is not so much a technical question. It's a question of having the will to do it. With the will, there can be a way. What the pandemic has shown us is our common humanity, our common sharing of a trauma. And never before in the history of humanity has this ever happened. Have people dispersed around the world had the same concerns and anxieties. And their concerns and anxieties, which we all share, are about how to live a healthy life, how to create jobs, how to overcome income insecurity, how to ensure that we create a more sustainable world, how to ensure that the values we've learned from this pandemic of the importance of each other, of being able to walk outside, enjoy clean nature, how that becomes the basis and anchors our decisions going forward. There's no reason why it should, and there's no reason why it should not. The question is, what are we going to do in the months and the year that follows this pandemic to ensure that it happens? My own view is that it's created a portal through which we could enter a better world. The question now for all of us is, do we wish to enter into that? The IMF, by providing the leadership it does on data, on economics, on institutions, on what works and what doesn't, and the vital lifeline which enables people to get over this enormous tragedy in their lives, gives us hope. It's through institutions like the IMF we learn about the value of multilateralism, the importance of good economic analysis, and the importance of data. And I thank the director and all the colleagues in the IMF for the work they've done, which gives us this vision of a better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Very much.
Ian. And, I think that was a very unique, compelling insight that you gave us, very stimulating, provocative speech, which raises many big questions. And to discuss those questions with you, I want to turn now to Kristalina and look forward to this discussion. I think we've got about 30 to 40 minutes. So looking forward to it. Kristalina, over to you, please.
Thank you. If we were to be in the days of all in the same place, you would have heard this. Great way to frame a clear vision for where we are coming from, where we are headed, and how us being together plays into it. And many questions, but let me start first by recognizing a very important point you made in the beginning of your keynote address about the deficiency of a phrase now frequently used, building back or resetting. I have been out talking about building forward exactly for the same reason you have discomfort. Where we are coming from wasn't so great. We had lots of problems, and there is a massive need of transformation towards a sustainable and inclusive economy and society. And the pandemic may help us to get there if we take on board the main lesson from it. We are in this together. We can only get get to a better place together. I want to start with a question about your book, the butterfly defect, and how globalization creates systemic risks. Because book, you actually predicted that a pandemic could be a major obstacle to globalization. And in fact, the pandemic indeed interrupted dramatically global value chains, our interdependence, and not only brought down our economy, but even more so, it restricted trade. For this year, we predict global growth to be minus 4.4%, and it looks like it would be just about 3 times as much the shrinkage in trade. So my question is, if you could give the listeners, the viewers, a sense as to how you came to your book. How did you come with the term butterfly defect? And how is this relevant for us to build forward, to come through this crisis stronger and more resilient?
Well, thank you very much. And I'm glad we share the concern about bouncing back and the dangers inherent in going back to the tracks we were on, which would be disastrous. The butterfly defect really came out of the financial crisis. I was very aware, and I felt a financial crisis was coming too, that I felt the measures being undertaken to address it were fighting the past battles, not the future ones. I thought some of the measures that were adopted, for example, to break up banks because they're too big to fail, were wrong and failed to understand concentration risk. So a Hurricane Sandy or a 9/11 attack in Wall Street, if it had been a bit different, could have created a global financial crisis. And none of that was addressed in the resilience measures being implemented by the financial crisis. It was all about trying to stop the sorts of things that had led to the financial crisis happening again. And having been working on globalization for a long time, and also interested in, my first degree was in physics and maths, interested in complexity theory and ideas around that, I became increasingly convinced that it was this hyper integration, this connectivity, which was not fully understood, and what you do about the nodes and networks in systems and our increasing dependence on these nodes and networks. The butterfly effect is a term that was coined by Lorentz, the famous physicist, to describe the phenomena that when a butterfly flaps its wings over the Amazon in Brazil, it could cause a tornado in Texas. This integration of systems and their unintended consequences. And obviously defect is just a play on that, because I think this is a problem, a defect of globalization that is not properly appreciated. Now, it has many, many manifestations, and it's basically about how do you manage complex interdependent systems, and that's what globalization has created. I'm a fierce advocate of globalization. I believe it's the most progressive force in the history of humanity, bringing more to jobs, more ideas, more opportunities to more people more quickly than anything in history, which is why we've seen this radical poverty reduction over the last 30 years, improvements in life expectancy, etc. But it's also the most dangerous force in human history, because this interdependence, and by globalization I mean flows across national borders of people, of ideas, digital, trade, goods, manufacturers, goods and bads, this interdependence also leads to a growing potential of destabilizing, and that's risks. And that's exactly what we see now. It's inevitable. Pandemics were inevitable. Any pandemic expert would have told you that we've been extremely lucky to escape them. We've had major pandemics in the first half of this century, SARS, MERS, avian influenza, Ebola, we got complacent. And just like I believe in finance, we've got complacent about the source of the next crisis, we've got complacent about pandemics. So it really is a need to understand the great risks we face come from this interdependence. They also come from the spillovers of the successes. Climate change is not because of the interdependence in the same way that pandemics, but it's a spillover of our success in the same way that antimicrobial resistance, for example, is a spillover. And that also requires management. Globalization is only as good as it's managed. The airport hubs are wonderful things, but we need to manage what comes through them, like cyber hubs, like financial hubs, etc. And that's really what the book's about, is why this is an issue and what we should do about it.
You very strongly advocate for coordinated action to deal with this butterfly effect. From the perspective of what we have been living through with this crisis, from the perspective of previous crises, what would you prioritize in this coordinated action? What do we need to do first? I heard you very clearly on the issue of there are organizations created to bring the world together. They are governed by their shareholders, and shareholders need to step up. That I take to be one of the priority actions. How do you achieve it? And what else would you put on this list of 1, 2, 3 to deal with the butterfly effect, globalization?
Well, I think the first thing to emphasize is that not all problems require global solutions. There are many issues, and we're seeing it now with vaccine distribution, where it's not necessarily a global institution, but a public-private partnership, the coming together of different actors that can do it. And indeed, with climate change, New York State emits more carbon than most of sub-Saharan Africa, except for Nigeria and South Africa. So key countries in most challenges account for most of the problem and most of the solution. And that's certainly the case in finance, it's certainly the case in cyber, and it's certainly the case in climate. Pandemics are unique, and so I think what we need to do is to go through a hierarchy of the great threats we face as a first priority. And pandemic is the biggest and most dangerous threat. Then there's the danger of nuclear Armageddon and a nuclear war. There's obviously climate change and a couple of existential threats. And then you go into threats around antimicrobial resistance, financial crisis, and you say, okay, that's the threat. We all recognize that's the threat. We might not put it in exactly the same place, but when you look at the intelligence agencies, those that are prepared to make it public ranking, they're pretty similar in terms of what the threats facing our countries are. And pandemics are way bigger than military threats, maybe 1,000 times greater for most countries. Canada, for example, makes its threats available, and you see that for Canada. And yet, then you ask the second question, okay, if that's the threat, what are we doing about it? And what you see is this total mismatch between the time, the effort, the political will, and the resources devoted to managing the threat. So let's say that most people recognize that a pandemic is 1,000 times more likely to kill us than a military attack. And yet we allocate 20,000 times more resource and energy to military than to pandemics. This disconnect between what the threat is and what we're doing about it. We have a NATO for military, and we're not giving the WHO the cost of one warship a budget. One big hospital in the US or the US Coast Guard has a bigger budget than the WHO. So it's that proportionality. Then I think the question is, can one actually do it? Can you stop pandemics? And there I think you really rely on expert surveillance systems, coordination systems, and those countries with the capacity to be able to allocate. And the same is true in many others. The pandemic is a unique threat in that it can come from anywhere in the world. The poorest country, the poorest place on earth, the meat market in the poorest country, or it could come from a lab in New York. And increasingly, the balance is moving towards artificial, synthetically made pandemics, terms of the risks, and crazy people with drones and things distributing them. So increasingly the risk is actually towards the rich countries with the most labs where the threat is. So this requires everyone, but most other threats require constellations of actors. If you had 20% of the actors, they could solve 80% of the problem and develop widening circles of coherence. That's why I believe we shouldn't allow the failure of some countries to come to the table as an excuse to not act. I think the rest of the world can get on with it. And even within those countries, states, cities, companies can be a big part of the solution.
Yes, I very much agree that a top priority collaboration for collective action is to match risks with preventive measures and response capacity. And in fact, we have seen after the global financial crisis a great deal of concentration on one particular set of risks. We limited it to banking sector rather than to all financial institutions, including non-banking financial institutions. And today, there are many who worry that the non-banking financial institutions may turn into a source of significant financial stability risk. And I'm bringing this example because what I would be very, given your unique qualification to have thought about this issue so much, is to ask you, if you take the global financial crisis, other crises that we lived through, and how we acted based on lessons, what do you expect would lessons we draw from this crisis that we would act upon decisively, and where we worry that maybe there are lessons to be drawn, but we would narrowly define the universe from which we draw them and miss? Analogy, the non-banking financial institutions in the example I gave.
Well, many people have talked about the 2008 financial crisis as a period of lesson, and certainly the response to it, and the fact that George W. Bush convened with many others like Gordon Brown helping. The response, I think, is important. But the crises that I think we can learn the most from are the bigger crises, which I think are, in a sense, the biggest crisis we've had before this one, which is the First and Second World War. And I've been doing I'm actually working on a book at the moment on the lasting impact of COVID and trying to understand what we should do next. And I'm very struck, and I've been interviewing the historian Margaret Macmillan, who's done a great set of lectures and books on these wars, about how it was that the First World War led to a downward spiral of the Great Depression, the rise of protectionism, nationalism, and an even worse war. And in the midst of the Second World War, while the bombs were literally dropping on Whitehall, Roosevelt, who was not a healthy man, in these freezing airplanes, they didn't have heating in the airplanes in those days, flying across the Atlantic, Churchill, Keynes, these people envisaged, while they were fighting on 5 fronts, and the bombs were dropping on their buildings in the UK, not in the US, they envisaged a different world. They envisaged the United Nations, the Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods institutions, the meeting a year before the end of the war, the UN even earlier. Just getting to that meeting was extremely dangerous for people across the Atlantic at that time. Still, the Beveridge Report that created the welfare state, 1942, in the middle of the war in the UK, and saying we will not allow the suffering to be in vain. We will create a better world. We will not allow the deaths that these young people are enduring to be in vain. And when the soldiers come back, they will be guaranteed housing, employment, and incomes. No one will starve in our societies in the future. In the US, paying artists building out of the New Deal before the war, after the Great Depression, paying artists to paint. As these ideas, which seem today to be not on the table. So for me, the big question is: are we in the First World War, or are we in the Second? Are we in this world that will lead to more division, protectionism, bad leadership, austerity after the First World War? Or are we in a world that actually understands this inflection point? As H.W. Wells said, in the First World War, this should be the war that ends all world wars. He never achieved that, but it was the case in the Second World War. We haven't had another world war, and we have the IMF and everything that comes out of that, and the welfare state. And that is what I think we need to look to the IMF for. We need to look to intellectuals, institutions. Where are the Keyneses? Where are the Churchills? Where are the Roosevelts? And when I ask the historians this question, are we just relying on the good luck of having good leaders? The answer is no. Those people were created by their time. In fact, Churchill lost power because he wouldn't support the welfare state in the UK. It was the demand of society for a better world and the sense of justice and right coming out of that suffering that created that opportunity, and the lesson of the previous war. In the Second World War, they said, we understand that wars can lead to more wars. Let's stop that. And the question for us now is, are we able to not be thrown over another cliff before we wake up? Are we able to use this as the wake-up call that we so desperately need to create a more inclusive, sustainable world?
Well, this is so great to listen to you reflecting on moment in history that are not entirely different from what we are faced with today, because we have the pandemic. But before the pandemic, we had already, you spoke about it, unexplainable low productivity, anemic. I remember Ian starting as managing director October last year and giving my first speech on synchronized slowdown. That was what we were most worried about at that time. Inequality growing since the global financial crisis in particular, almost everywhere, a looming climate crisis. So we do face significant challenges, and on top of it, we're now living through a pandemic and is going to have long-lasting impacts unless we act. And that takes me to my next question. What do you see being paramount in terms of building a kind of commonality of objectives, building a vision for post-pandemic where we actually do address some of these fundamental challenges that we have been facing? I, for one, am particularly worried about slipping into expanding inequalities, landing in a place that is like Dickens's Tale of Two Cities, in which one part of the economy, the tech part, the digital part, does really well, and people are better off accelerating transformation because of the pandemic, and another part of the economy falling behind or falling off the cliff altogether. How would you, and then of course we have the climate crisis, how would you sequence the attention? You rightly said that in the war, it was a matter of we make a better world. How would you describe a better world from where we are coming now?
Well, for me, a better world is a world which is more inclusive and sustainable, where one's life chances are not defined by who one's parents are or where one's born, where everyone has equal opportunity. And that is absolutely possible, and we've seen it happen so many places in our lifetimes. It's the success of globalization, by which I mean the spread of ideas and technologies and investment. that's created that possibility around the world. And the real question now is, do we stop that? Do we basically say, okay, those that are rich will stay rich and those that are poor are going to get poorer? Now, that will be politically toxic and unsustainable. What we saw after the 2008 crisis, of course, was that the places in Southern Europe particularly, where we got very high levels of unemployment, became very, very populist and extremist. In Italy, in Spain, and elsewhere. The places that were more stable, that had managed themselves more effectively through the crisis, began to support more values-based economies, as we see in Northern Europe. The Green Party, for example, does much better in Northern Europe and is non-existent in Southern Europe, because people are worried about their daily living, about getting a job, and are prepared to support those that argue that they'll bring those things. I don't believe that we would have seen Brexit in the UK, or indeed President Trump in the White House, if it had not been for the financial crisis. These catastrophic events lead people to lose their jobs, to lose faith in the establishments, and to become very angry with the status quo. And it's not surprising, I would be too if I was in their situation. I'm not sure I would have voted the same way, but you can see where the anger comes from. And it's that failure to create an inclusive society, a cohesive society, that leads to these increasingly polarized societies like we see in the US, like we see across Europe. And although this was meant to be the great leveler, it's been the great splinterer of societies in many respects. So what your question is the right question, probably for a CEO or managing directors, what to do. And in my view, the answer is going to have to come from pretty strong different measures. So, I think we have to be in a world where we're thinking about higher taxation. Extraordinary statistic I heard, IMF can always test its statistics, but that if Jeff Bezos had given a bonus of $100,000 to every worker in Amazon, he would still be richer after the pandemic than before the pandemic. If there was a 5% wealth tax on the tech billionaires, they would still be richer after the pandemic than before the pandemic. So I think we have to be thinking about redistributive taxes. We have to be thinking about inheritance taxes. We have to be, as you are doing with your colleagues in the IMF, thinking very deeply about where growth is going to come from, where jobs are going to come from, and particularly that will manage both the challenge of the climate transition, which we have to get to net zero by at least 2050 and hopefully before, but also creating sustainable jobs. And your colleagues are doing fantastic work under your leadership on this. But it's now a time of taking this to heart. In the UK, we see a very worrying tendency, I believe, at a time when it's never been more needed. There's a discussion now of cutting the aid budget. Now, already, of course, because aid is a share of GNI, 0.7 this year is going to be in many countries 10 or 20% less than it was last year. And in the UK, they're talking about going down to 0.5. Today, the Prime Minister announced 16.5 billion new pounds for the military. Now, these are the choices that will shape the way that societies go forward, and not only domestically, whether we're able to overcome our divisions internally, but also globally. If we are to say to the countries of Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and elsewhere, that we can create a sustainable world by working together, we need to demonstrate solidarity. So my own view is that we are likely to see this. Now, a key question, which I think is particularly pertinent to the next administration in the US and also to Europe, is how does one work together with people you don't agree with? And my own view is we don't have a choice. There's no global problem that will be solved without China, Europe, and the US working together. And so an absolute bottom line of solving global problems has to be that we might not agree on some things you do and some of your actions, but we will work together because we respect our mutual ability to solve the problem. And it's that go to fix the problem attitude which has to apply to the management of the butterfly defect.
I I so much agree with you. We actually have taken at the fund a very systematic pathway to look into taxation for the 21st century. And there is a specific question I would be very interested to hear your professional view on. You talked about digital and the problem we have in measuring intangibles. If we were to have the digital economy to support a more inclusive development, how do we measure its contribution? Do you have any concrete recommendations for my colleagues that are charged with making sure that data is as reflective of developments in reality as possible? Is there something that you would recommend to us to do on that front?
Well, you know, you're the experts and I'm the student, so this is a difficult question to learn. I've got a team of 10 wonderful postdocs in Oxford who, amongst other things, are trying to get their heads around this, and there's a series of papers on our website that reflect on this. But I think part of the challenge is to think about the question of where production is happening, where the value added is, and this tension between national and global is absolutely acute. The depreciation allowances that are built in to intellectual property, into other non-tangible assets is absolutely right. The valuation is often very, very difficult. How do you value intellectual property? How do you value software, etc.? And it can fluctuate very vastly. But my sense is that we're going to, and then there's this question of offshoring, just sort of not knowing where it is because it goes into some black box in the Cayman Islands or somewhere. So my sense is that we're going to have to, in a way, try and triage this in two respects. One is we're going to have to work on revenue or profit-based when it comes to taxes metrics rather than on others. And I'm very in sympathy, for example, with what the European Union and Commission are doing in this respect. And I know that that's part of your background at the Commission. So you know, some of these numbers are just totally out of kilter in terms of the revenues generated in a place and the tax paid. It's also true, by the way, of the financial sector, not only of the digital sector, banks. And the second is going to be to try and insist, and I think we'll have to come through regulation, that we get greater transparency on what the intellectual property is that's being valued, because a lot of it's just in a safe. Now, it might never be used. And that raises a whole other question, which is you know, beyond, in the sense, the IMF's domain, but is something which I know will be at the heart of the new administration in the US, and it is at the heart of the administration in Brussels, which the regulation of tech firms and what data they share and don't share, and this big question, which is related to the productivity question, which is, are the superstar firms vacuuming up intellectual property and competition and undermining the competitive landscape, even if consumers love them for what they're giving as so-called free goods, not paying for the data. So those are all questions, but I would encourage, and I will follow up with your colleagues on this question by putting them in touch with people, my PhD students and others who know much more than this than I do.
Well, that is why we always count on the younger generation to bring ideas. This is really fascinating conversation. I want to ask you, as you know, I'm given a signal that we need to aim to wrapping up. Time is flying. In closing, since this was about the kind of economics of pandemics and do we have the data, if you were to draw the lesson from this pandemic for how we anticipate, predict, prevent, and respond pandemics in the future, what do we need to do to have necessary information for it? You spoke about WHO, need for WHO to be on stronger footing. What else do you have in your toolbox to fix that?
Yeah, I mean, I just briefly on the separate health and economic dimensions of this. On the health dimension, there has to be surveillance everywhere in the world in a way that becomes centralized and analyzed, and that's all possible with existing machine learning and other capabilities. I think where we're heading to is the use of mobile phones as tracking devices for biopathogens, for possible pandemics. I think what we have to head to is the global distribution of SWAT teams, of rapid response teams that are distributed globally, that can be in any location in the world within a few hours in order to analyze the data, in order to, if necessary, to isolate it. And that is within capabilities. So I think within the future, if we have the will, all our mobile phones or smartwatches and other bracelets and things that we could have would have that capability of sensor devices. Then the question is, can you respond effectively to the signals, and how do you do that? And of course, we are making immense strides. But this is all something that the WHO has the capability to manage if it's given the mandate and resources to work with people and with countries. The economic data that I think we've learned that we're so unable to understand some of the dimensions. That granularity I talked about in my lecture, the need for real-time data, for the access to data, whether it's from the tech firms or whether it's from other aspects of the economy, and the ability to analyze that at scale, which is going to require much greater machine learning and AI capabilities in data, because the volume of data is, so vast. That the normal Excel spreadsheets, as we've even seen in the UK, we discovered that one of the reasons we couldn't track and trace is because our Excel spreadsheet ran out of columns. Is that sort of issue is very much a thing of the past. So the capability to manage it, and then in the seat that you're in, of course, to coordinate with your colleagues around the world, and that is something which needs to be greatly invigorated. My hope is we won't have another pandemic, that this will be the pandemic to end pandemics. But if we do, we will be in so much better position to be able to respond. And of course, the vaccine manufacturing capability also needs to be geared up and be on standby. These are tiny amounts of money, tiny compared to the cost of the pandemic. We're talking about 1 millionth or even less of the cost in prevention. And it's time we make that investment.
It is a great place to land. The simple, straightforward, and very important lesson from the pandemic: prevention is better than cure. Hopefully, we would apply this to climate risks and other types of shocks. So we have resilient people, we have resilient planet, resilient finances. And we as a world are together to make sure we get to that point. Next year, we are going to talk about climate indicators related to climate, how data can help us with this other crisis. And hopefully, Ian, we can count on your thinking,
Always.
your inputs on that ground as well. I want to thank you most sincerely for your contribution. Fantastic to be with you. And now I think I pass the floor back to Jerry to wrap it up.
Thank you, Managing Director. And thank you so much for what you're doing. I mean, if I sleep at night, it's because I know that you're not. So thank you very, very much for everything you're doing for everyone.
Yeah. This is true. Somebody asked me how was the pandemic affecting me personally, and I thought the answer is I sleep less, I work more, and I remember how to cook.
Yeah.
Jerry, back to you.
So it just remains for me to say thank you to great leaders, to good friends. This was a wonderful conversation to listen to be part of, and in many ways inspirational. Ian was asked to give his assessment of the lessons of the crisis, and I was writing various things down. But the one that really is sticking with me, Ian, is the pandemic has shown our common humanity. I want to leave this discussion on that note. Thank you, Kristalina Georgieva. Thank you, Ian Golden. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. Goodbye. Stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.